So I'm just going to give a quick overview of my background, why you should care about climate, climate and health, which is sort of my entryway to climate science, climate solutions, and really there is hope. We are the solution. And so I want to talk about the climate entrepreneurial ecosystem as a whole. Next slide. So my background is in product management for healthcare, meaning IT and strategy and innovation, as an entrepreneur, as a futurist, as a poet, as a meditator, and as a nature lover. And those are really important because they're different lenses kind of on the same issue. Next slide. So in my own climate journey, I always have had a strong connection to nature. That's really infused this kind of perception of nature as a living being. Starting in 2015, a friend was very insistent that we pay attention to the underlying science of climate change, that it was going to get worse, that it was irreversible, and that it was super important to understand it. During the pandemic, I began to study climate impacts on healthcare. And getting futures certification really helped me go into 10-year, 20-year, 30-year futures, look at different drivers and trends against us. And also went through a climate accelerator this year, and that was a tremendous help in understanding the ecosystem. Next slide. So why should you care about climate? It will impact every area of our lives.
Sorry to interrupt you, but the slides aren't moving virtually, just FYI.
Oh.
Okay. The screen? Yeah. Let me stop sharing and I will share again. Give me 1 second.
Okay, do you see a slide that says, why should you care about climate?
Now I do, yes.
All right.
Okay, sorry about that.
It's going to impact every area of our lives, where we live, whether we can stay in our homes, what we eat, the availability of food, what we buy, how we make choices, our ability to heat and cool our homes, travel, our health, air quality, our both the built environment that we live in, as well as the natural environment, social stability, global economy, and our jobs and how we work. So in summary, everything. Next slide. So this was my entrance to climate. Even though this is kind of a busy slide, what it's really saying is that climate is going to produce both health impacts, but also the destruction of a health ecosystem. During hurricanes and floods, you can't get to the hospital, roads are down. People who are already vulnerable, pregnant women, young people, the elderly, are going to be under a lot more stresses. We've got heat-related illness. We have pulmonary and asthma-related things like happening with the West Coast fires. We've got insect-borne diseases. We've got zoonotic, meaning diseases that jump from animals to people, like COVID. We've got tremendous pressure on people's hearts due to stress and heat levels. And we also have tremendous exacerbation of mental health problems. So in other words, what we think of in terms of climate and pressures on the environment, weather patterns, hurricanes, floods, really translate to serious health issues. And we're going to be seeing more and more of that in the future. And that was sort of the pathway that helped me understand a lot of climate impacts. So next slide. Next, okay, great. Yeah, global warming. So when we think climate change, we're hearing a lot about temperatures, global warming, reduction of temperature goals. And to understand climate, it's helpful to understand heat emissions and carbon. The heat aspect is very palpable. We can see even in Connecticut, temperatures increasing, weird weather, 100-degree summers. We've seen, hurricanes and floods and droughts, but it's important to understand that the Earth is kind of a living system. And so we're seeing one aspect of this, but in reality, there's a whole, it's as if the circulatory systems, the heating and cooling systems of Earth are being eroded and destroyed. Next slide. So the greenhouse effect is important. We hear a lot about polarized caps melting and heat, but this is a relatively straightforward equation. As the ice melts, less sunlight is able to be reflected back into space. So that means that there's more ground, which produces more heat, which causes more heat in the atmosphere. So it's a kind of a self-fulfilling circulation problem of the Earth. And I wasn't aware until I began studying this how Earth systems worked together and really what emissions are, what they look like, where they're generated from. Next slide. So what we're talking about with the carbon cycle is what is going up really isn't coming down. So we have all of these sources of emissions from electricity, from agriculture, industry, transportation, heating and cooling of buildings. It's all going up into the atmosphere. A large portion is remaining up there, but a lot is reabsorbed into the earth through what are called sinks, carbon sinks, land sinks, the coasts and the oceans. So the earth is very much alive. And these systems traditionally, historically, over the course of millions of years, help store carbon, right? Carbon is stored in trees. As plant matter decomposes, it becomes coal and oil. But as we rip this out from the earth, we burn them, we release them, we're actually reversing this. We're pumping up more carbon dioxide and more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere with less ability to store it back into the earth. So here we go into this sort of earth as a living ecosystem whose livingness is being disrupted. Next slide. So this is a transformation map from the World Economic Forum, and the World Economic Forum is super important because what it is it kind of presents information in these wonderful infographics, which are clickable, and you can drill down into different levels, you get links to articles, resources. So highly recommended as a great learning pathway. But one of the things that we're seeing is, glaciers receding, ocean heat and acidification increasing. The surface temperature of Earth is increasing. We saw this report on the surface temperature of India increasing and how dangerous that is. CO2 concentrated in the atmosphere, less ability of the oceans to process carbon and support life. Next slide. So we're also seeing rising energy consumption. So we always hear about renewables, more solar, more wind energy, geothermal, but what's happening is emissions are going up, not down. So it's not just the extraction and the mining, but it's also the transportation, the war that goes on over resources, energy use. Next slide. So when we talk about emissions, we're really talking about these kind of clusters. And why this is really important is because in the problem lie the solutions. So in other words, the industries that are producing the most have the greatest opportunity for transformation and some of the biggest economic opportunities. So heating and cooling of business, buildings, transportation, and just energy consumption. So the way that we're burning energy and releasing more emissions into the atmosphere. Also, we have a lot of the solutions kind of built into that. Next slide. So we have this idea of the carbon surplus, meaning there's way more carbon being pumped up than there is being absorbed either through natural mechanisms in the atmosphere, into forests, into the oceans. And we're doing some other things with agriculture. As more land is transformed into, say, raising cattle for beef, that means less trees, less ability to absorb CO2, more disruption of the soil, more transportation issues. So we're creating this kind of cluster of events, which if we don't stop it, is going to get more and more cataclysmic. Next slide. So the idea of the carbon surplus, which is deforestation, ice melting, increased emissions, warmer, more acidic seas, more vehicles on the road, more building projects using steel and concrete. We're increasing rather than decreasing the problem. So next slide. So really to summarize, climate change is getting worse. We're disrupting the heating and cooling and circulation mechanisms of the Earth. Many aspects really are irreversible, that the polar ice took millions of years to form. Like I said, it will impact every area of our lives. Climate urgency will affect every business. Every job will become a climate job, and every company will become a climate company. And we are the solution. In other words, the UN won't bail us out, the government won't bail us out, Apple won't bail us out. It's our solutions which will actually solve things. Next slide. Whoops. I think we skipped one. That's okay. Climate. Whoop.
Nope.
Climate solutions.
Nope. I'm going the wrong way. Just this one.
Yeah, climate solutions. So
Oh.
we're honestly, even though there's $100 billion a year going into climate startups, we're at the very beginning of these solutions. We're still in its infancy, and it's ultimately a $1 trillion economic opportunity, and that will ultimately dwarf every other sector of the economy. I mean, it's immense, and so that's really the exciting part. Next slide. So my entry, apart from studying climate impacts on health, was really to participate in a climate accelerator. This one was called On Deck, which is a company in Silicon Valley that has a lot of different accelerator programs. And it was my first exposure to really the world of climate solutions starting in January this year. So I'm relatively new to it, but I want to share what I learned and the possibilities. And because there's a vast opportunity to change the world, and there's great opportunity for entrepreneurs and startups and business people. So our idea was a company called Global Connect, and we had folks from all over the world: Rwanda, Turkey, India, Pakistan. Patrick, who works for the EPA in the US, his background is in Africa and Sierra Leone. And so we wanted to create kind of a model for teams coming together and working globally. Next slide. So our MVP, we built a platform and an app where people could come together from around the world, learn about climate solutions, and build cohorts and teams to tackle these problems. And these type of collaborations and self-organizing teams, like I said about HAYVN, is kind of the map of the future. There's something in the NFT world called DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, where you've got these groups and these cohorts that come together. And so our focus is on adaptation and preparing the world and helping other people to get into climate change. So education, individual learning pathways, coming together in community and taking climate actions. Next slide. So we hear the word climate tech, and so what is it? These are companies that are involved in reduction. So in other words, sustainability, circular economy, reducing emissions, reducing waste, reversal and regeneration, that's removing carbon from the atmosphere, planting trees, electrification through non-fossil fuel sources, renewable energy, and adaptation and resilience, preparing for a new world. In other words, since so many aspects are irreversible, what can we do to actually prepare and help people for this world, even apart from all of the climate solutions that we're building? Next slide. So the solutions, like I say, are really going to be found in the problem. So the very issues that are generating the most emissions, the most waste, the most carbon are actually the areas that huge amounts of investment are going in to solve. So next slide. So the climate tech focus is really on mobility and transportation, so electric vehicles, different energy sources, energy itself, the grid, which is so, carbon-based, to look at alternative sources, food, agriculture, and land use, including like large-scale reforestation projects, industry and manufacturing, working with the supply chain, looking at the incredible energy-intensive manufacturing process for, say, steel and concrete, built environment, renewable and sustainable strategies for building and commercial real estate, financial services, and the carbon market, where people can buy offsets. Let's say you are a carbon emitter, you can actually buy offset through planting trees or working on carbon reduction to sort of, if you like, equalize the balance of what you put in versus what's coming out. Next slide. So this is from a book and a website called, whoops, I think we missed, maybe I switched one more down. We'll go up, whoop. I wonder if we lost one. Up again, yeah.
This
okay,
one?
yeah,
okay.
Speed and scale, okay. So this is a guy named John Doerr, who I think was either Kleiner Perkins or another giant venture capital firm, and he just gave $1 billion to Stanford to create their first climate school. But his sort of systemic view is we need to electrify transportation, so electric cars, electric trucks, moving away from all fossil fuels for mobility, decarbonize the grid, which is a fancy term for switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, fix food, protect nature, clean up industry, remove carbon, meaning there are technologies which can actually suck carbon out of the atmosphere and sequester it or store it in different places, win politics and policy, turn movements into action, innovate and invest. Go down one slide. Yeah, we can go there. So giant amounts of money are actually going into climate tech. So we're slated to go past 100 billion, I think, this year. There are more than 3,000 climate tech startups, immense year-over-year growth, and we can kind of go into that. Go down one slide. Okay. Global funding is kind of an exponentially increasing. And so this is very, very exciting because there's a tremendous venture interest in climate companies. And there are new climate companies being formed all over the world. So it's super, super exciting. But we're looking at this kind of exponential growth curve. I think that's kind of the message I want to give. Next slide. So again, from speed and scale, increased government R&D, increased financial incentives, venture capital is already on track to blast through 50 billion a year. Increased project financing, philanthropic investing. I think there's been a lot of recent news releases from, say, New York City. They want to do a big renewable energy project. Some of the big success stories are really through cities as they try to adapt for climate change. Next slide. The breakdown of where climate dollars are going is very similar to the problems. So mobility, energy, food, water, and kind of this consumer goods. So next slide. One more. So I'm going to go, oops, I think we're going the wrong direction. That's okay. Oh, sorry. No, we're good. Oh.
This one?
Yeah. So Wasa, who's on the Global Connect team from Rwanda, this is her slogan, which is we need more zebras and camels and less unicorns, meaning in Africa, for example, African entrepreneurs need much smaller amounts of microfinancing, like $5,000 or $10,000. They don't need $1 billion. And this whole focus sort of on Silicon Valley unicorns can be distracting for what's actually needed to create sustainable businesses around the world. Having said that, there are a huge growing number of billion-dollar valuation companies within climate, and they're really, really growing, which is, it's very exciting because it shows the tremendous interest and the urgency of this. So next slide. Okay, we're going to blast through kind of some examples of climate companies. Rivian is sort of high-end electric trucks and SUVs. Next slide. ClimateX is a company in London that does, it's really climate risk management. They can take a building or a city and they can actually map out the financial effects and the financial risks associated to climate on a very kind of granular level. So very exciting work. Next slide. This is stuff I'm super interested in. Pachama, what it does is it's kind of doing carbon credits. So what you're essentially doing is purchasing either forests themselves or protecting forests. Next slide. So what they do is a lot of satellite mapping of different forest areas. And so if you're, say, a company that's emitting, you can purchase carbon credits to essentially either plant trees or protect forests. And what you're doing is really helping sequester the carbon in the forest, or just increasing the amount of carbon that can be recaptured through this landmass. Next slide. Sadhana Forest, this is it's kind of a bootstrap startup in India that I've always supported. What they do is kind of regenerative agriculture based on planting trees in communities on a large scale, which can then help the soil. Some of these trees produce fruit that can feed communities. So you get a lot of bang for your buck in both reforestation, but also creating, sustainable food for communities, changing water and land use, etc. Next slide. Climeworks is actually one of those carbon capture companies where we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere. I think this facility is in Iceland, and we're going to see a lot more of this, which is direct carbon capture, either creating freestanding facilities or placing these on commercial buildings to try to capture and store carbon out of the atmosphere. Next slide. Commonwealth Fusion is one of those unicorns. They're actually developing a fusion energy system, which could potentially replace all other energy systems if they're successful. It's a kind of a Hail Mary type of a company. If they're successful, it's completely transformative. Next slide. So there are really three pathways to get involved. One is, your individual and company actions. One is to get a job within climate, and one is to found a climate company. So like I say, even though it's in its infancy, we're at the beginning of like this giant tsunami of change. So it's a very exciting space to be in. Next slide. Individual actions. So, we've seen these before: reduce your water consumption, recycle, ride your bike to work, deal with the way that you cook. So we've seen a lot of that, like we're all familiar with that. Next slide. But I think it's really what businesses can do. COVID forced everybody to decrease travel, so that took care of that. But from a business perspective, investing in renewable energy, for me, I think joining a climate accelerator is crucial to learn about the ecosystem, learning, purchasing carbon offsets in the form of planting trees, reducing waste, shopping locally, being very aware of the supply chain and the energy consumed along the way, supporting sustainable businesses, and taking part in policy. Next slide. So this is a fabulous community called Work on Climate, where people are essentially helping each other get climate jobs. Very active Slack community, wonderful community and support. One of the nicest things I think I found about working in climate is the supportiveness and encouragement of the whole communities. The next form is accelerators. Next slide. Sorry. Yep. Founding a climate company. So that for me has been the most exciting thing. These are typically global. They provide mentoring, help with your pitch decks, connecting with angels and venture capitalists, providing market info and guidance, finding co-founders. Some do direct equity investments in your company, finding peers, accountability, and community. And I'm just going to go over a couple of quick ones. Next slide. Acumen Academy is actually one of the oldest and has done direct investments in Africa and Indian startups, and they provide a lot of courses. They were founded by a woman named Jacqueline Novogratz, who wrote a fabulous book called The Path of Moral Leadership. Next slide. Clean Tech Open Accelerator. They've got actually programs nationally. This is one of the most recognized tech accelerators. Next. Startup Basecamp. They've got a very important program about 20 women driving the future of climate tech. So they're really focused, at least on this series, on female founders, but they're a global company and a wonderful community. Next slide. Impact Hustlers. This is London-based. I'm a part of this community. They're really important, providing mentoring, peer support, great podcast series. Next slide. Third Derivative in the US and India, another important startup. Next slide. Urban Futures Lab in New York City. Next slide. Elemental Accelerator. This is a woman-owned startup. Next slide. My climate journey. I think this is another really preeminent site, highly recommended. They've got a podcast. They've got a very active Slack community. I think it's about $100 to join. This is really kind of the place that people go to find out about climate as a whole. Their founder came from another startup, and he essentially created a community based on his own learning journey, where he interviewed people, created podcasts, learned about climate, and then just basically shared what he learned. Next slide. This is the My Climate Journey Slack community, really active, people all over the world, extremely important source of information. Next slide. Active Hope is really a course to go from climate anxiety to climate action with Joanna Macy, who is a long-term American Buddhist and activist, most notably anti-nuclear, and Chris Johnstone, who is a medical doctor. But this is a really great free course. Next slide. So this is a quote from Diego Espinosa, who founded a company called Voice, which is a distributed autonomous organization focusing on college students. And what he does is take college kids from all over the world, and they create cohorts and they solve climate issues. But this quote is either you have values or you don't, which I think is a fabulous quote. The origin of this was people were complaining that, well, climate finance, we don't really see the benefit of that. And what his point is like, you either have values or you don't. You can either address this or you can't, which is if this is aligned with your purpose and your mission, then just go forward and do this. Don't necessarily worry about anything else.